Hi, good afternoon. It is 12:01, so I think we're going to get started. Folks are still joining. I see that some folks are still coming in, but we'll start with introductions and hopefully everybody will be on for the meat of our programming. So good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us today for the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility's Lunch and Learn. My name is Angelica Kang. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Chief Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Officer here at OCFS. I'm so glad to have all of you here, especially because I'm really excited that we have the Trevor Project here to present. Some of you may know that for a while now, I've been hoping to have OCFS host the Trevor Project here, so it's a big deal that we've finally been able to do so. I'm not going to take up any more of your time, but once again, on behalf of all of us at OCFS, thank you for taking the time to be here with us to learn on this critical subject, especially in a time like we are presently in. I'm going to turn it over now to OCFS's SOGI officer, Karen Sessions, who I also would like to thank for all of her work in organizing and putting together today's lunch and learn. Thank you.
Thanks, Angelica. And hello and welcome to all of those from OCFS who have joined this Lunch and Learn. And also a special thank you to those from local departments of social services or voluntary agencies who were able to also attend today. As Angelica said, my name is Karen Sessions. My pronouns are she and her. And I too work here at OCFS in the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility as the SOGI officer, which stands for Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, and Expression. Before I introduce our presenter, I would like to just provide a little background and share that this opportunity to work with the Trevor Project was based on previous conversations generated through our OCFS SOGI subcommittee and through discussions and based on the political and legal environment that we are all navigating. The SOGI subcommittee felt strongly about creating a lunch and learn presentation that helped us be reminded of our work here at OCFS and to bring attention and focus on best practices to support children, families, and youth who are LGBTQ identified. So we are really thrilled to have the Trevor Project here, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kyle Teller, who is the Public Training Manager for the Trevor Project and will be presenting today on the CARE program. And I would also like to mention that Dr. Teller will also join us again in April, on April 30th, and present on the Trevor Project's Ally Training. Details for this presentation will be shared later this month or in early April, so be on the lookout for that. So at this time, I'd like to pass the mic to Dr. Teller.
Thank you so much, Karen. It is wonderful to be with everyone here today. So we're going to kick off with our CARE training, and our CARE training is LGBTQ plus suicide prevention. So just be mindful as we're here today that I will be mentioning data about suicide. So if you need to take a 5-minute break or anything like that, I am never offended. But thank you all for being here. And I am Kyle Teller. I have a PhD in English with emphasis in adult learning, cultural studies, and writing, and I use this to better LGBTQ lives. And in prior work, I also did this in kinship care educational programming as well. So I'm familiar with the kinship work and family reunification within child welfare, as well as a lot of the dynamics that you might be encountering. So a little bit about me is I'm the public training manager currently at the Trevor Project. And so what we're going to be going over today are a little bit about facts and myths about suicide, because we want to know how to recognize and, again, understand why these myths are harmful and what facts can be useful. Understanding suicide with data, risk factors, warning signs, and protective factors, and then more ways that you can help. So some things to keep in mind. We are going to go through a lot today, but this is only the beginning. Another thing is that you will all receive a copy of this deck. So if it's shown on the screen, you'll receive a copy, but if you want to make a note of something I verbalized, please do. And that everyone in this room is also going to have different experiences. So maybe you're part of the LGBTQ plus community like myself. Maybe you're not and want to be an ally. Everyone is welcome here. So we're always going to be non-judgmental. Now, if you haven't heard of us, or maybe you know us a little bit, the Trevor Project is the leading suicide prevention and crisis intervention organization. And we are for LGBTQ plus young people. So you'll hear me say young people quite a bit. And for us, that means 24 and younger. Now, that doesn't mean that our mission stops there, of course, but our mission is to end suicide among all LGBTQ plus young people. And that means that everyone here today can help be part of that. So there are two sides to Trevor, and one is our crisis services. Crisis services runs 24/7, 365 days a year. Now, this is a free 24/7 service for LGBTQ plus young people to call in if they need crisis support, or if they just need someone to listen to. So we call that kind of a warm call. This is that service. I do advise everyone to write down these numbers now or later and have them in your phone or another way to share. You don't need to know if someone's LGBTQ plus or if they're in crisis to share these resources, because they might not be out to us, or we might not know how their mental health is going, or maybe they know someone. So it's really important to have this information ready. Now there's 3 ways to call in. There's Trevor Chat, there's Trevor Lifeline, and Trevor Text. So chat's on our website. And for safety, maybe there's someone's using a home computer, we do have a quick escape button. So that way folks might, again, we always want to prioritize safety. If they're on a computer where someone else might be watching, there's a quick escape button. But Trevor Chat is really helpful as well. And every single one of these is connected with a live trained counselor. And then there's Lifeline where folks can call in, and Text where folks can text. Now, on the other side of our organization is prevention. So we don't want to just wait until a crisis occurs. We also want to help prevent a crisis from occurring. And that goes with a lot of different arms of our organization. And one of those is Trevor Space. So this is a social media site for LGBTQ plus young folks and their allies, ages 13 to 24. So they're actually divided into 2 age groups on Trevor Space. And this is a social media site just for them. So ages 13 to 17 is in one group, and ages 18 to 24 is in another group. And this is their social media site where they can meet people who are like them, share similar experiences, or even share their favorite movie or a game that they're interested in. It's only moderated for safety. Just want to make sure that people are there, again, behaving with one another, being in community with one another. But it's a wonderful support space, especially for LGBTQ plus young people who might have a hard time being around or finding people in person who share their identity. And we also have our research team. They do everything from write and publish peer-reviewed articles to a lot of those you'll actually find on our website in briefs. And if you're interested in the full PDF, if you email me, I likely can get it for you as well. If for any reason it's behind a database. We also have our mental health survey among LGBTQ plus young folks that is released annually. And last year alone, they collected over 18,000 responses from LGBTQ plus young folks in the US alone on ways that we can better their mental health as allies, as people in the community, challenges they're facing, and what's going on in their lives. And then we have our advocacy team. They work at the local, state, and federal level. So whether that's grassroots or state partnerships, they're working and collaborating with people to make sure that we ban harmful LGBTQ plus bills and promote the good ones. So one example is we want to ban conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is the incredibly harmful practice of trying to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. Every major health organization has denounced this because it increases the risk of suicide, and it doesn't work, nor should that be the goal to change someone's identity. So when there's a conversion therapy ban bill in there, we want that ban to go through. So another part of our organization, and this is probably my favorite because it's my team, is education. I work with adults such as yourselves on how to become better allies. I work across the US, whether that's in person or virtually. And I work with every type of organization you can imagine, or even community members who form groups. So that is a bit about the Trevor Project. Now, I want to work on those facts or myths about suicide to kick us off here. And I do not believe in punitive testing. So if you guessed wrong, there is nothing wrong with that. You just learned something. But I'm going to share a statement with you, and I want folks to chime in the chat on whether or not you think it's a fact or a myth. All right, first one, suicide happens without warning. Is this a fact or a myth? All right, that's correct. Myth. So there are warning signs, and we're going to learn some of those here today. And again, I will reiterate this throughout our time together. It is no one person's responsibility to prevent a death by suicide. It is a community effort, but we can look for those warning signs. People who attempt suicide are weak, crazy, or selfish. Fact or myth? I'm seeing a lot of responses. Yes, yes, yes. This is, of course, a myth, but unfortunately, we hear it all the time. This is one of those cultural myths. So what I like to say is it takes 1 second to spread a lie. It takes a lot more to educate ourselves and unlearn those harmful myths. So this is something that we need to really check our language about. We do not want to speak about people in any mental health condition and use the words weak, crazy, or selfish. That is moralizing and judgment-based language. And it's going to ultimately mean that we are not creating a safe space for people to share that they might be suicidal or to even talk about mental health. All right, people who talk about suicide are just trying to get attention and are not really going to make an attempt. Fact or myth? All right, I'm seeing a bunch. Yes, that is a myth. So, and what I like to work with on people is we always want to believe people. That's the bar. If they say, I need help, they need help. Now, for that person you might be working with, or even for yourself, if this is a struggle where you're saying, well, I just think maybe this has happened too often, or you're questioning something, say, what is the risk in believing them? Because the risk in not believing someone is suicide. And that's something we can all kind of agree on, hopefully, especially if you're meeting with people and working with people, maybe families or other adults, or even your own members or relatives. And they say, well, I just think people are doing it for attention. One of the things that you can ask them is, what are you afraid of? Because if they're asking for attention, that means they need help. And I think if they need our help, we should help them. And my fear is suicide. And that's the risk if we don't believe them. So even though this is really common to hear, we might know they're myths, we're still going to encounter them, and we should talk with the other person about them. All right, here's another one. If you talk about suicide, you're giving people ideas. I'm seeing a lot in the chat. Yeah, that is a myth. We're opening a dialogue about suicide. We want to normalize it, and that means we do need to talk about suicide. Now, I will say, if you paused because you said, well, there could be productive or counterproductive ways, that is also true. But in general, talking about suicide isn't giving people ideas. We're not going to get into graphic detail. We wouldn't obviously say, here's methods or suggestions, because again, that's not what we're doing. But hearing people and where they're at, that's what our focus is on. And that does mean talking about suicide. All right, there's nothing you can do to stop someone who really wants to kill themselves. Fact or myth? Seeing some different ones. This is a little tricky. We can prevent suicide. It is preventable. It is no one person's responsibility. So if someone dies by suicide, that is, again, terrible, but it's not one person's responsibility. But there are options for getting people support that do work. So we want to remember that this is a preventable death, but it is one that is not one person to bear. All right, another one. A suicidal person will always be suicidal. Fact or myth? Okay, seeing a lot. Yes, this one is also a myth. So maybe you caught on, but these are all myths. But they are myths because they exist, because they are perpetuated. They are repeated in our society. So for someone, I do want to acknowledge this might be their daily experience. That is their reality. But that doesn't mean we can't hold out hope for tomorrow and help them connect to resources and talk with them. Suicidal ideation can also shift. So just like we don't know, and we don't say, and I can't stress this enough, folks don't say it gets better, because we can't just promise a guarantee. We don't want to make false promises, but we can say things like, I'm going to be here for you. How can I help you? And be that person to be alongside them and to help build a support network as well. But we also don't know that that person will be suicidal tomorrow. Things do work. We can help prevent it. So we want to be with them, with their emotions, wherever they're at. But we also do want to hold out hope that that suicidal ideation or planning can shift. Now, let's talk about some of the data, because suicide in our country is a crisis. So for example, and this is over a 21-ish period of years, it has increased by 37% in our country. So suicide has increased by 37%. And I will say in 2020, there was a small blip. I'll just put a little asterisk there, where it did decrease a small amount in 2020, but then it steadily rose again. So you can basically consider that chart as just inclining with a small little downward and then rise again. It is the 9th leading cause of death across demographics, so all people ages 10 to 64. And I do want to recognize that for younger people, because I do think we miss out that younger children are impacted by suicide. But for those ages 5 to 11 in the US, it is the 8th leading cause of death. So this is a crisis in the US, and it is preventable death. Now let's zoom in a bit. So for those ages 10 to 14, it is the 2nd leading cause of death, and 3rd for those ages 15 to 24. So we've already seen that it's 9th overall for 10 to 64. For younger kids, 5 to 11, it's 8th. But now as we get into that 10 to 24 range, we're looking at 2nd and 3rd leading cause of death. Now for LGBTQ plus young people, the situation is much more dire. 39% seriously considered attempting suicide. That is 4 times more likely than their straight or cisgender peers. Cisgender is those whose sex matches their gender identity, the sex they were assigned at birth. So that's 4 times more likely to attempt suicide this last year. 1.8 million plus LGBTQ plus young people seriously consider suicide every year. And this isn't coming from nowhere. 60% reported they experienced discrimination based on their identity. 50% wanted to get health care but could not. And I want to focus on this last statistic as well. 40% of LGBTQ young people, in most cases, had a lowered suicide attempt by 40%, if an adult was accepting in their lives. So allies make the difference. You can reduce suicide attempts by, in most cases, 40%. By being a supportive ally. And I will say acceptance is not tolerance. We tolerate traffic, we do not tolerate identities. So we support people, especially LGBTQ plus young people. That's what can lower suicide. Now, whenever we're talking about this data, especially concerning LGBTQ plus young folks or of all ages, we want to make sure that we're really clear that it is not their identity that puts them at risk of suicide. It is not true. It is discrimination and stigma and societal barriers. It's the external pressure and discrimination put on LGBTQ plus folks. So that is what is increasing suicide, not their identity. Now, I mentioned that 50% of LGBTQ plus young people this last year sought mental health, and they wanted to get mental health care, but they could not get it. Now, there's 10 main reasons why, and I won't go through each of these, but they fall under 3 main categories for why they couldn't get mental health care. And one of the big categories is accessibility. Mental health care is expensive. It's hard to get. It relies on perhaps job status or caregivers or parents having access as well. So accessibility is one of the reasons, and that's a pretty universal reason, I'll say as well. But if you're LGBTQ+, you're also going to experience anti-LGBTQ+ stigma, which means you might have that experience of, I was afraid I wouldn't be taken seriously, or I was not out and I was afraid I would be outed during this process. Even getting their caregiver's permission could unintentionally out them, which for some folks, they might not want to be out to that person, and that's their choice, and we can never force that. We can just make a safe space for them to feel comfortable coming out. But if for other people, it can actually be a high safety risk, because research shows time and time again, and the experiences, particularly for LGBTQ+ young people in child welfare, where they experience family rejection, both from their primary caregivers as well as foster families. So we see this rate of family rejection, which leads to, unfortunately, things like housing instability and experiencing homelessness. So even access to mental health care could lead to additional risks if they're LGBTQ+, because of, unfortunately, bias and discrimination. Now, the third reason that folks couldn't get access to healthcare is because of mental health stigma. So I did not feel they would understand my sexual orientation. I did not want people to think something was wrong with me. You can kind of think about how culturally we have mental health stigma already. We saw a lot of suicide myths that we hear too often. And so that creates a stigma to even have the conversations about suicide. But another thing that goes hand in hand is you're working with mental health stigma that sometimes also targets you for being LGBTQ+. So I did not feel they would understand my identities, and they could even think, oh, they might be blaming my identity instead of the barriers I'm facing, or a mental health struggle that's related to those barriers, not trying to fix who I am, because we know how harmful that is. So I want us to all remember, though, that one accepting adult can make that huge difference. That reduction in suicide attempts in most cases by 40% is real. And this is really important for us to remember, because it means being consistent allies in all spaces with all people, not only when you're around LGBTQ+ young folks or their friends or that community, but whenever you're working with people in general. Now, there are good ways to talk about suicide that are productive, and I'm going to share some of those techniques with y'all. So we have on the left side here some ways we don't want to talk about suicide, and there's good reason for this. So on the left, we have committed suicide, successful or unsuccessful attempt, and failed attempt. And on the right, we have the corrections for this. So folks, why might we not want to say successful or unsuccessful attempt? If you want to chime in the chat. What could be harmful about saying successful or unsuccessful suicide attempt? I'm seeing an answer. It sounds like it could be a good thing. Yeah, so it's a judgment basis. Absolutely. It sounds like it will happen again. Positive, you failed. Positive, yes. All these are correct. It's passing judgment. So let's say someone wakes in the hospital from a suicide attempt. The first thing they hear is they were unsuccessful. That is a horrifying thing to hear after a suicide attempt. So there are ways to talk about it that are more, again, accurate and non-judgmental, and don't pass this morality. Because suicide is not about a moral condition. It's not about how well you are as a person or how bad you are doing as a person. These are all those judgment myths. It is a mental health condition where we are, again, just saying, let's get support, let's get resources, let's figure out what we can do. So instead, we want to say died by suicide, not committed, because committed also has a bit of criminalizing language in there as well. We're not suggesting crime has happened. We're just stating facts. So lethal and non-lethal attempt, or instead of failed attempt, because it's not a failure, it's just attempted suicide. No one is a failure in this situation. It's not a success. We're not romanticizing it, and we're not suggesting someone is a failure ever. All right. So there are risk factors that may put people at more likelihood of experiencing suicidal ideation or suicide attempts. And so this is not the full gamut of risk factors, but these are some key ones. So mental health condition, accessibility in particular to firearms, as we often see that as a main means or other means, experiencing homelessness or housing instability, family crises, academic pressure, non-suicidal self-injury, loss or grief, victimization, and a history of suicide in the family. Now, some of these disproportionately impact LGBTQ plus young folks. So family crises could be family rejection. It could even be that their family has to go somewhere safe because they're not safe in their community for being who they are. So the crisis might not be always the family where they're saying, we don't accept you, we're not going to support you for who you are, or even kicking them out of the home, though we do see that. The family crisis could also be the family trying to get resources that are cut off from them. So we want to acknowledge that crisis does not always mean it's the family's choice. But whenever it is about accepting someone in their family or kin, that is where we want to see that acceptance in particular and standing up for people. Now, experiencing homelessness, this comes from that rejection, which can happen both in foster care and in with their caregivers. But this is where we often see that is experiencing homelessness at a younger age. Non-suicidal self-injury, loss or grief, and victimization, these go hand in hand. If you're experiencing victimization, and this again disproportionately impacts LGBTQ plus young people, because they're going to experience discrimination at national scales, at community scales, schools, among family members. There's a lot of different places and avenues that if you're straight or cisgender, you might not notice because you're not at risk. And that can lead to things like non-suicidal self-injury as, say, a coping mechanism. Now, there are other risk factors, but these are the key ones that we often see disproportionately impacting LGBTQ plus young people. Now, we do not all exist as one identity. We exist as a host of identities. So it's always important that we talk about intersectionality. So Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term to describe her unique experience as being both Black and a woman. Previously, there was only a way to talk about it as separate things. So she could only say, well, I'm experiencing racism or I'm experiencing sexism, when in fact, all parts of ourselves are working and informing our experience all at the same time. So she herself has broadened it to include all social categories. So whether that's documentation status, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, class, race, and so forth. All of that is informing our experiences. So for example, can you go to a store and walk out and not have to be expected to show a receipt most of the time, or not have that be a reality for people who share your identity? Are you able to be who you are with your partner in all spaces without fear of victimization or discrimination? Can you go to the bathroom that matches your gender identity without hassle or even having your body inspected by a stranger? These are things that inform our experiences all the time. Now, what's the part of our work at Trevor Project involves minority stress, because we know if you're part of a marginalized group, you're more likely to have suicide risk. This doesn't mean it's a for sure thing, of course. You're just at greater risk because you're more likely to experience that bias and stigma. So minority stress is more persistent and problematic if you occupy multiple marginalized social positions. So for example, a Black trans woman, again, we're going to love our communities. I love being a queer educator. I love my community. But a Black trans woman is going to experience much more likelihood of the discrimination, rejection, and stigma simultaneously than, say, a gay, white, cis man, because he might be experiencing homophobia for being gay, but he also has the privileges of race and gender, so being a cis man as well as white, where she's also going to face racism and transphobia on top of the sexism of women. So we want to always remember that. And yes, I see in the chat misogynoir. So this is the term specifically for when it targets Black women or Black femmes. So the reason this matters, especially for suicide, is because we might have the same stressor, some event that happens in our lives. But remember, risk factors mean we'll likely have, depending on our privilege or relationship with oppression, more or less access to resources including mental health care, for example, including to finances, housing, and so forth. So when a stressor happens in one person's life, that same event could happen in another, and we're not going to be impacted the same because we don't have the same risks and we don't have the same privileges. So for one example, let's say that the people I gave in the first example, crisis threshold is here. And we'll say that this is a white, cisgender, straight man who has a death in the family. That is a terrible, terrible event in anyone's life. But because he likely has access to maybe resources or healthcare, and again, I could say middle class as well, there is a lot more likelihood that he could receive better services if he has that access. And another thing that we talked about earlier with mental health care is it's hard if you're queer to find a professional who is not going to treat your identity as the issue if they're not trained to be an ally and also understand the stigmas you're facing. So if that same event, maybe a death in a family, is introduced into an LGBTQ plus person's life, especially if they're a person of color, they might have less access to those vital resources. So that can push them over the threshold and into a place of crisis. So that's something we all want to remember here. So yeah, trust in the healthcare system. If there is a long history, both for LGBTQ plus people and people of color with issues with trust in the health system, because unfortunately, both of our communities were used as experiments. And a lot of the information is catered specifically to people who do not share our identities. So much of the original research was actually done a lot on considering white cisgender men's bodies. So we don't always have access to the same healthcare standards. And then we also want to address that stereotypes come into play. There's the very harmful stereotype of the strong Black woman. This is something that's talked about a lot in healthcare, where it's perceived that Black women are inherently stronger so they can tolerate more pain. That's a stereotype. So unfortunately, it has real world impact. And that leads to a lot of Black women not receiving good physical health care because they're presumed that they can handle the pain. And again, it's not bad that anyone can be strong, but we don't want to lean into stereotypes, particularly when they're impacting people's livelihood. And for LGBTQ plus people, especially if they're at the intersections of being both a person of color and queer, they're going in there facing someone who might not understand their identity at all, and who might not even understand how to support them from anything from mental health care to physical health care. So that's a little bit about why we need to understand intersectionality, as well as understanding our relationship with privilege and oppression, because we're all being shaped daily in our experiences, but we might not recognize that. So I mentioned earlier that there are warning signs to look for suicide. So some of these warning signs fall into these categories, such as mood, and I do say talks about, but that's communicates. So however the person communicates, and that could be through writing, text, images, however they're communicating with you, and behaviors as well. So if they talk about killing themselves or feeling hopeless, having no reason to live, feeling like a burden or trapped, these are warning signs. Now, behaviors, this could be increasing substance use, withdrawing or isolating from people that they care about or activities, sleeping too much or too little. So kind of look for that big change, visiting or calling people to say goodbye, giving away prized possessions, and fatigue. And I want to address that, yes, these can be signs of other mental health conditions happening, but we want to also treat these as suicide warning signs and take them seriously. So we're not here to diagnose unless that is your actual professional relationship with the person, but we are here to look for the warning signs and connect them to resources and support. Now, under mood, depression, anxiety, loss of interest, irritability, agitation, anger, and then major or sudden mood changes. So if it's just a big swing, and then relief or sudden improvement. Now, why might relief or sudden improvement be a warning sign of suicide? Because sometimes this trips people up, and I do understand why. I'm seeing in the chat a couple of responses that they've made a decision and that decision is final, or that they feel less burdened by it. Yeah. So for those of us on the outside of it, it can look like a positive. Yeah, absolutely. But we do want to still treat this as a warning sign. So you can still be hopeful. You can still hold that in your place, but you still want to do a check-in with them and ask, hey, what's going on? I'm noticing you seem really different today. How are you feeling? And then let them describe how they're feeling. Because we could also be misreading the signs as well, but we want to check in. Yeah, all of these are correct, that they feel that they have given over the control of it and made a decision. That is why it's also important that relief or sudden improvement, we're still considering it a warning sign. Now, LGBTQ plus folks, particularly young people, have additional stressors too, and these can increase risk of suicide. So not fitting into gender norms. The idea of what our society says is typical for someone of their gender identity or expression. And again, these are just stereotypes we're putting on people. We're saying, I know you better than you know you. And we don't want to do that as allies ever, or as people who care about someone's mental health and physical health, because they go hand in hand. So just remember that it's not the person's identity putting at them risk, it's the responses from society. But not fitting into gender norms can create real challenges. So an example I give is a common young person experience is prom. Great, maybe they're stressed about prom in general. A lot of young people are. But the additional stressor of, can I even go as who I am? Can I wear a suit? Will I be forced into something I am not actually comfortable with, that gives me body dysmorphia, that makes me feel not who I am, not in my body, and creates mental health struggle? Can I go with my partner? Will that even be allowed? Will I be able to dance with my partner without being receiving harassment or more? These are questions we don't want people to have to ask, but unfortunately, a lot of LGBTQ plus young people have to ask this, and not just inside of a prom situation, but in a lot of different situations. So rejection can be particularly hard, especially at doing so at a young age. I did mention that family rejection in particular can mean and lead to housing instability or homelessness for young people, which increases their risks of being involved in juvenile justice, and increases their risk of really harmful things like being trafficked. So this is, again, disproportionately impacting LGBTQ plus young people. Because what do if you're 14 and you don't have a home? You can't get a job. So again, this is putting people at risk. And family rejection, even if they don't experience homelessness as a result, is still an incredible burden and pain for LGBTQ plus young people and adults. So we want to remember that, to be these supportive adult allies who have their back no matter what. And then discrimination and victimization and developmental stressors. How are you going to know about your development if you're not allowed to read about yourself in schools? What are you going to do if people are too scared to say you even exist? That is a stress that is uniquely for LGBTQ plus young people and people of marginalized communities who are seeing DEI pulled. So that is something we want to address, is developmental stressors are another burden. And of course, when you talk about discrimination and victimization, if all you see on the news is your community being targeted and you don't see people standing up, and you have to see this day in and day out, it does impact your mental health. Now, there are protective factors. These are things that can buffer from the harm caused by those risk factors and even help decrease those risks. So some examples, and again, this is from one of our surveys, 18,000 plus LGBTQ plus young people came in and said, here's what would be helpful for people to know more about our lives and be more supportive. So just be supportive and accepting, learn more about gender identity, sexual orientations, pronouns, creating safe spaces, the gender binary, microaggressions, racism, and intersectionality. They want folks to know who they are and to understand that they know who they are. So a lot of this, if you're coming to our next session for ally training, we go over some things like microaggressions and pronouns and identities. But this is what they're saying. I want you to understand who I am and support me. There are other protective factors. A lot are such joy-based, but some examples are having queer role models, all gender restrooms, which is suicide prevention, because unfortunately, we see suicide attempts rise with bathroom discrimination. And this disproportionately impacts trans and non-binary young people. So in this last year alone, 1 in 3 trans and non-binary youth had a suicide attempt who experienced bathroom discrimination, with 1 in 5 having multiple suicide attempts. So they are linked, and no one should have to question whether they're allowed to go to the bathroom that matches who they are. And all gender restrooms can be great for everyone. I know I'm from a small town or a smaller area where we had a lot of single stall bathrooms at gas stations or things like that. This is not new. So just removing that it has to be binary can be a suicide prevention. Cis and straight allies, learning that I'm not alone, victories and protective rights, having queer elders and married couples, hope and excitement for the future, gender affirming clothing. So a lot of this goes with understanding that young people do know who they are better than someone outside their body and their mind, and trusting in them, because that was also a number one response from them, is trust that I know who I am. So there's other things, music, partners, drag shows, which if you're wondering and you've heard some of the, again, stigma against drag shows are just like any other performance. So if you are at a concert and it says it's for 21 up, then it's for 21 up. Drag shows have ones for kids, they have ones for teenagers, they have ones for adults. It is the same as any other performer. So whether it's a musician or a drag performer, there's for all ages. You just have to understand that there are some where they're doing library reading, and then there are some where it's obviously more like a concert or 21 plus venue. So that is another one that they said is helpful, though, is drag shows, dance, living as themselves, and so much more. Now, here are some more ways that you can help. So I'm going to show this brief video on empathetic listening.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So that was a video by Brene Brown, but it really breaks down the skills of empathetic listening. And I know that we heard the silver lining where it says, oh, well, at least you have. Now, I would say that a lot of us have both been the person who's been on the receiving end of it at least and done and said at least. Because it is unfortunately part of us trying to say, I want you to feel better and I don't know how. So if you've done that, it's okay, but let's move to more productive practices with empathetic listening. So reflect the person's language back to them. So if they say, I'm in a bad way, I'm feeling suicidal, say, hey, I hear you're feeling really in pain right now. You can paraphrase a little bit. Tell me what's going on. And then validate and normalize. So that can look like saying, hey, a lot of people feel suicidal. You're not alone, but I know it's unique to you. And I want to hear about what it's like for you. What is it like for you? Yes, I'll include the link to the video as well, but a lot of this goes into making sure that we're staying in that place with them, even if it's a dark place, and that we're not trying to force them to bright side. We're not judging them, which is part of this, is staying present and non-judgmental. And that means we're not just saying, oh, but you have all these nice things, or, oh, but aren't you looking forward to this? We want to stay with their feelings in the moment. And then minimal encouragers. So that can look like nodding or going, mm-hmm. I know folks who don't love eye contact, so attuning to their body language and what they like and asking and saying, hey, would you feel more comfortable if I sat on this couch and looked over here? And just checking in with them on finding what works best. But the minimal encouragers can show that you're actively listening. And then express care, concern, and encouragement. So let's say you were totally caught off guard, or even if you're just not practicing this, that's okay. It is more than okay to say, I don't even know what to say. I'm just so glad you shared what's going on. So you can say, I don't know what to say, but thank them for sharing so they know they did the right thing. Now, part of why we call this care is because we're connecting people to resources, accepting and listening to how they're feeling and taking their feelings for who they are and where they're at right now, responding if they're planning a suicide attempt, and then empowering the person to reach out to services like us at the Trevor Project, where we have trained counselors to listen. So again, a reminder, you are not responsible for any one person's death by suicide. Again, if you are actually that person's mental health professional and have different policies abiding by that, do abide by those, but all we can all do is listen and support them and connect them to resources. So for example, let's say someone tells you, I hear you can't just take it anymore. So they say, I'm done. I want to die. We can say, I hear you saying you just can't take it anymore. Now, this next part, we need to ask the same way every time. So this we don't paraphrase. And that is, are you thinking about killing yourself? Because we need a firm no. Or if they say yes, maybe, I don't know, I'm unsure, we take all of that as a yes, because it's too big of a risk. So anything but a no is a yes. And we do need to say directly, are you thinking about killing yourself? Because are you thinking about harming yourself means something else, for example. And then, of course, expressing that care. So saying it sounds like you're in a lot of pain, or however they're sharing with you. Now, if they have any yes, maybe answers, so anything but a no, we do want to assess for risk. So how are you thinking about killing yourself? When are you thinking about killing yourself? Where are you thinking about killing yourself? And within each of these, we do want to make sure that they answer. So if we say, how are you thinking about killing yourself? And they say, with a parent's gun. Then we want to follow up and say, where is the gun right now? Because we do want to assess where it is in relation to them, because it might be in the room with them. It might be miles away. So we do want to follow up. And same with when and where. And if they have access and means, and you don't have to be an expert on knowing what can cause a death by suicide. Any means we just take as a yes, it could cause a death by suicide because we don't know. So if they have the means, if they have a location that they can access, and it's within 48 hours, we consider that imminent risk. And at that point, you want to connect them to services so that way they can get support. And that way we can also make sure they're safe. Now, if they have told you something like, the gun is in the room with me, when you ask that follow-up question, you say, well, how would you feel if for our conversation, we left the gun in a drawer and we walked outside to have the talk. It's about harm reduction. So we don't want to panic and say, get that gun away from you right now. Okay, that's a little panic that could cause them to escalate. So we say, how would you feel if we put the gun down and we walked outside together? Or we talked on the phone outside. It's about getting them away from means of suicide and connecting them to support. Now, if they're not at imminent risk, then we can ask what brought on these thoughts today, but we do want to make sure we're assessing. And it takes practice. But remember to keep open-ended questions so people continue to talk. And even though you might be feeling internally saying, oh, there's so much at stake and I'm feeling a certain type of way, it's okay to have that feeling and still talk with people. So when you're asking questions, we want to keep it open-ended and non-judgmental. We don't want to make assumptions in our questions. So open-ended questions usually start with what or how. So like, what is depression like for you? And then allow them to guide the conversation. I'm here to listen. What do you want to talk about? And this also can take the pressure off of you because you're not responsible for coming up with solutions for them, unless they're directly asking that or that's your role. But if they're saying, I just want to talk about feelings or I don't know what's going on, keep talking with them. So here's some examples. Directive are the ones on the left. We want to avoid these because they're making judgment-based ideas or assumptions. Like if my partner were doing that, I'd want them to stop. Or we're offering solutions when we should be listening. So yoga would help you. We're not there to provide solutions to this. We're here to listen. So unless they've asked us what are ideas that I could come up with and say things like, what is something that you've thought about trying but haven't? Because maybe they just need the space to share. So we want to ask open-ended questions. Now, there's lots of ways to be an active ally. Empathy that we talked about today is a huge one. And then mirroring language back. So mirror the person's language and stick with them with their feelings and where they're at. And then be intentional and thoughtful about your questions and comments. I'm a queer educator by choice and trade, but every LGBTQ plus person is not there to educate you. There's so many resources out there to do that for you, because it can be a lot of labor that's often unpaid for that person. So if they share, do listen, do respect their lived experience, and do honor it. But if you're seeking educational resources, we have a ton of Trevor as well. Using pronouns is suicide prevention. So for trans and non-binary young people whose pronouns were respected most or all the time, suicide attempts were half as much as those whose pronouns were not or were respected or not respected. So if we respect pronouns, it reduces the suicide risk by half for trans and non-binary young people, because it is basic human decency to say, I see and I understand who you are, and I'm going to respect your name and how you call yourself. Now, I mentioned all gender bathrooms as suicide prevention. Again, 1 in 3 trans and non-binary youth who experienced bathroom discrimination had a suicide attempt this last year, with 1 in 5 having multiple attempts. So all gender facilities are beneficial and they can be beneficial for all. But I do want to really make it clear that it's the trans and non-binary folks who are at risk, not cisgender and straight people by all gender bathrooms. They're the ones who are being harmed. So encourage and facilitate self-advocacy. So amplify LGBTQ plus voices. So whether you like to read or you're a researcher, consider what you're digesting, even movies, even podcasts, whatever you like to do. Are there queer voices that you could be listening to understand another perspective that maybe you're not attuned to at this time? Look up mental health resources, keep learning about LGBTQ plus identities. And then also, of course, look at company and organizational structures. So do you have a non-discrimination policy that includes LGBTQ plus people? What do those practices look like? And can you help oppose anti-LGBTQ plus legislation and support LGBTQ plus non-discrimination? And that looks like a lot of different things, but we do have a Trevor advocacy line that you can join, and I'll send that up in a follow-up message for advocacy alerts in your area as well. And some of the advocacy is one-on-one, I will say. So if you are encountering someone in your life who is speaking and saying things about LGBTQ plus folks, that are stereotypical, harmful, based in stigma or ignorance, talk with them. Have the conversation with them and say, hey, where did you learn that? I wonder what message that's sending to LGBTQ plus young people. They're at risk of suicide because of the words people say. And if more of our straight and cisgender allies stood up to the people in their lives, we would have a lot less to fight against. So here are some places you can learn more. We have our research briefs on our website. We research everything. So even LGBTQ youth in small towns and rural areas, LGBTQ youth and autism, there's so much we have on research. We also have free resources and guides that you can download and share. Please feel free to do so. And these are just examples. There's so much more. And once again, my name is Kyle. My pronouns are she, her. And I would absolutely love your feedback for today's session. And we have just a few minutes left here today. But if you have any questions about our training, I will include a follow-up message with this deck, as well as this survey, and my email and our team education emails. That way you can ask me questions. And I'm one of those people where if you ask even a week later or a month later and you finally remember, oh, I forgot to ask this, I will be there to answer. So please make sure you check in with anything from today or any question you might have on how to support LGBTQ plus young people. And I greatly appreciate your feedback.
Thank you so much, Kyle. It looks like most folks are thanking you profusely, and I just want to thank you personally for being able to do this presentation, which will be shared along with some additional resources that are New York State based. So for all of those who joined today, we will be sharing your information as well as some other resources. And just thank you so much for walking us through this important information in terms of understanding risk factors, protective factors, the use of language, the simple things that we can do to affirm individuals that could greatly reduce their risk of suicide. So this is just so appreciated. Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for inviting me. Like Karen said earlier, we will have an ally training. And Karen, what's the date for that one again?
That is April 30th.
April 30th. So if you want to join to learn more about our ally training, terminology, and other things you can do as an ally, we'll cover that there as well. But thank you so much for today.